So it is 2:03. Good afternoon, I guess. It's already 2. I hope you had a nice weekend. So we continue from where we left it at. Of course, today we are beginning now. We are scooting to the macro economics bit of our course. If there's something major that we are doing today, is actually that we are now going to the macro. So far, from topic 2 to topic 5, we've been handling microeconomic issues. So today, with us scooting to the macro side, of course, it behoves us to at least have an appreciation of what macro economics essentially is. But perhaps before we continue and as we wait for the others, I don't know why today attendance is low. The exam timetable is already out. I think we have been given Monday, but it's still provisional. Provisional in the sense that even I think the class rep for what? For I think natural resource purity engaged me and told me that it seems to be clashing with one of their courses. So I imagine that we shall have it sorted out within the week. Maybe it will be moved, but that might not be the final time for the SEM. But anyway, I shall be engaging the timetabling office to see what can be done over the SEM. Right? As I was telling her, I'm desperate that actually the exam is done on or before 9th, because first from 10th, I should be away from the university. So I shall be coming with a definite date, maybe once the final exam timetable is out. Right? Otherwise, CAT, we shall still be doing CATs, I believe, next week, but contingent on us being able to finish up on the course within the week at the end of the day. We'll be a bit flexible. Actually, it will be next week. Question being whether it will be on a Monday or whether it will do it on a Thursday. Right? So, of course, being the first macroeconomic topic, we must actually remind ourselves what is macroeconomics as opposed to microeconomics as we defined it earlier. And when you talk about macro, it's all about getting the bird's eye view of things. So far, we've just been concerned about decision making with regard to either a few economic agents, an individual economic agent, or maybe a sector within the economy. But macro can be thought about simply as taking the whole cake. Think about the whole cake. Think about the totality of the economy, so that if this cake were to be thought of as the totality of what we call a given economy, whenever you're considering macro issues, you are essentially considering kila kitu, kila mtu within the economy, so to speak. So if it is not a cake, unaona hapa, I'm not so quick in dividing the said cake, right? Ile ingine nilikoko ninachora keki and then I divide it, right? Na nawaambia maybe hiyo ni sekta fulani ama huyo ni maybe somebody like Purity or something, or Nyanjong or something. Lakini saizi sasa tunaangalia kama ni hii class tunaiangalia yote. Tunaangalia matakwa ya class yote, so that now when we make deductions are with respect to the totality of the economy rather than just a given part of an economy. Very, very important to consider that. Understanding causes and consequences of fluctuation in such concepts as business cycles, national income, determinants of economic growth. Like you cannot talk about economic growth and we just consider one person or a group of people. It will be a bit misleading. The aggregate of the whole economy has to be captured in considering issues of macroeconomics. Here is where now you shall hear me talk about government quite a bit, rather than an individual, rather than a household, rather than a farm. Okay? Because when you think about the government lazima ikuwe na, and government conversation must cater to the totality of the economy. Sasa tunaongelelea maneno ya tax. Na leo nimeona kuna MP amesema ya kuwa ni jukumu la the whole watu ambao wamekuwa employed to carry the whole economy. Hiyo saa zingine hizo ni vitu ambazo naziitanga adhari za shibe. Wengine wao wanashiba mpaka sasa wanaona they can just talk the way they want. Rather than talking about, and in the last bit we shall be talking about things like equity. Right? And when we shall be considering them, we shall be considering them with regard to the taxes. How fair is it that me, being a person who is employed, a person with a pay slip, should be paying, and then there's somebody within the same economy who is not so quick to pay for the same. Okay? So these are the things that we shall be remonstrating with in these macro topics at the end of the day, right? When you hear about things like national income, consumption, unemployment, inflation, and we are just about to begin about inflation in the next few minutes, national savings, government, investment, international sector, they are best handled whenever the totality of the economy is considered rather than just a part of it. Okay, so far we've just been very, very comfortable talking about just a part of the economy rather than the totality. But for us to do justice to these topics, right, as established, they are best approached when the totality, the aggregate, that's one word you shall hear me talk of quite a bit whenever you hear about the aggregate of the economy. Aggregate is summing up. Kwa hivyo si mtu mmoja, it's not me or a bit of you, but when the whole class is considered, the aggregate of the economy is what now informs this macroeconomic space. And why macro? Because actually, if you think about these topics as they have been enunciated here, and we are just about to begin about unemployment and inflation, one will have an appreciation that they are best approached from a macro perspective. We kama umesota imaanishi kila mtu amesota hapa Kenya. We umesota, unalilia baba yako ama Mungu wako. There's somebody who is buying the latest model of a Prado out there. Umeona kuna mtu aliimport, I think, a car worth 56 million just the other day. The sky didn't fall off. Sky bado inaendelea because ni kwa raha zake. So you can imagine kama tunaweza chukua his example and then we say that Kenya is not doing too badly, na kuna wewe ambao umesota hapo, kidogo kutakuwa na shida at the end of the day. Ama wewe umesota, tuseme ya kuwa Kenya iko na shida mingi, alafu kuna hao ambao wananunua magari ya 60 million, will not be doing the best deduction. It's always good for us to say kuna hao alafu kuna wewe at the end of the day. I hope I'm not depressing you too much. Kini kama ninawadepress, tafadhali, just take the lessons there. We encountered this framework in our introductory topic, aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. It's a very, very important framework in macro economics. I cannot really overemphasize its importance at the end of the day. A macroeconomic model explaining the relationship between national output and price levels through this aggregate demand and aggregate supply. You always hear economics, if you now come into economics balance, you'll more often than not hear people talk about demand side or the supply side of economics. I'm trying to look for an these people have made really Zoom nowadays to be quite complex. You'll always hear these concepts. Today I'm having to really use the Zoom pen because the normal pen that I normally use, I don't think you guys you can get the red as easily. You'll always hear people talk about demand side or supply side economics. Essentially, what they'll be talking about actually is, from a technical point of view, this model of aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. And as we saw, when we talk about the components of the same, when we talk about aggregate demand comprises of right, consumption, investments, government, exports, and imports. And from an equation point of view, we'll normally just express it that way. C, I, G, X, M. C plus I plus G plus X minus M, right? And what does it mean? As knowing algebra, we know that these ones that are positive, consumption, investment, government, export, and imports, the positive ones, an increase in them will always have an effect of increasing the aggregate demand of goods and services within the economy. Aggregate demand actually is the summation of all demands within the economy, right? In topic 2, we were talking about just the demand curve for a specific good, a demand curve or a demand function for a specific services. But here now we are summing them all up. And actually we end up now getting what we call the national output, what we are calling the summation of demands, of quantity demanded in the economy. We end up with what we refer to as national output. So any increase in consumption, investment, government, and exports will increase aggregate demand. And we shall actually argue that this is where you want the economy to perform at. Right now, unasikia Wakenya wana complain sana. And they are right to complain because I don't believe the economic activities is where there should be. But if from an economic point of view, we can talk about maybe the diminishing or the decrease in aggregate demand, maybe decrease in consumption, decrease in investment, decrease in government expenditure, decrease in exports, or increase in imports, leading to a decrease in aggregate demand. I think the last, as I was waiting for this class, I even just saw a TikTok, somebody complaining that nowadays even banks have changed their requirements. It's not as easy for you to get money that is in the fixed account as it was before. They're talking about the timelines or even the time. If you are to give them a 24-hour notice, nowadays they're talking about even 2 weeks or even to a month notice at the end of the day. Sawa sawa. So that's the aggregate demand. When you talk about the aggregate supply, we are talking about, I don't know why I never wrote the equation, but the equation can simply be expressed as C plus S plus T plus X minus M. So C is consumption, S is savings, T is taxes, X is exports, and M is imports. In a way, the supply side of economics, the summation of goods and services, firms are willing and able to sell at a given price and for a given period of time, right? The aggregate prices, and when we shall be defining inflation shortly, is what we refer to as time level, price level, right? The aggregate of prices within the economy. We'll be talking about it as price level. So now when we bring down these two concepts together, it should serve to remind you of what we saw in topic 2, when we have the price and quantity demanded. But here, because we're talking about the aggregates of the two, here we shall be arguing that this will be the prices level, the aggregate of prices, and the aggregate of quantity demanded, what we refer to as national, the aggregate demand curve, and we have the aggregate demand curve, the supply curve. Now, when you talk about optimal price levels and optimal outputs within the economy, we talk about us getting that intersectionality of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, giving us the ideals in the economy at the end of the day, or the framework expressed in graphical form, basically giving us these two curves, as the case may be. So having introduced aggregates, the macroeconomics, and maybe that's basically broadly how macroeconomics must be understood in a nutshell. Did we introduce micro? No, we introduced it via the theories, but we didn't have this talk about it. But when you talk about macro, there is also a need for us to understand that general framework. And because when you talk about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, this is applicative, whether we'll talk about inflation, whether we'll talk about in unemployment, whether we'll talk about national income accounting, whether we'll talk about monetary and fiscal policy. Those being the three topics that we shall be handling, we can apply, arguably, this aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework to each and every one of them. And we shall actually even just use it in inflation shortly, when we shall be distinguishing the types of inflation at the end of the day. What is inflation? I was laughing when I was following the US elections the last year or so, and I was hearing Trump saying he will eradicate inflation. He was talking about eradicating inflation. And I was like, wait a minute, are you sure? That is one thing that you'd wish to do as a president. Is it even possible? for you to even eradicate the same, right? Because in economics, we talk about that not even being an ideal in the economy. Economic inflation must and should happen. And as we shall see, there's what we call good inflation, there's what we call not so good inflation. But how do we define it? Inflation is the general sustained increase in the price level. I underline that because, and I always tell my students that when this comes in an exam, and you write to me prices rather than price level, kama ni kitu ya max 2 utakuta una lose mark 1. Because when we talk about prices, I'll ask you prices of what? But when you talk about price level, I immediately understand it as the aggregation or the summation of all prices of goods and services in the economy. In other words, can be thought about as an average of sorts. So the general and sustained increase in the price level of goods and services in a given economy is what we refer to as inflation. There are two types of inflation. There's what we call the demand pull inflation, and there's what we call the cost push inflation. What do we mean by the two? And which one is the good one and which one is the bad one or not so good, and for what reason? You'll see that in demand pull inflation, we describe it as an increase in the price level caused by an increase in the economy's aggregate demand. I repeat, the increase in price level caused by an economy's increase in aggregate demand. And one will ask, what are the aggregate demand? As we saw it comprising of aggregate consumption, aggregate investment, aggregate government the aggregate of government activities, aggregate exports, and aggregate imports. And as I said, and as I argued from a cursory understanding of algebra, if this is an equation, then it must be the case that if there is an increase in aggregate consumption, if there's an increase in aggregate investments, if there's an increase in government expenditure, for example, if there's an increase in exports, then ceteris paribus, holding all other factors constant, aggregate demand will increase. Because imports is a negative, then it must stand to reason that only decrease in the value of imports can lead to an increase in aggregate demand. Okay. So whenever there is an increase in consumption, ndio maana lazima ukiona vitu kama kazi kwa vijana, right? Na mnasema ati ni siasa iko hapo. Yes, kuna siasa, lakini kwa kadri mkubwa kile kitu kinafanyika ni ya kuwa the economy is being stimulated through the encouraging of consumption within the economy through increase in aggregate consumption. Those who have been keen with the debate in the economic realm in the last actually 2-3 weeks, watu wanasema ya kuwa Zakayo amekuwa akisema ya kuwa inflation imerudi chini. And people are saying maybe that is true, but if I don't have money, or if my money is not coming in the way I'd expected, because now you can see that this is the month that they took upwards of even 20,000-30,000 from our paychecks because of the so-called social health insurance. So I'm like, kama mimi ni mtu wa kuenda hata kukunywa nje, I'll not go. I'll say I'd rather sacrifice that money. I'd rather not even go out. If I was to buy an item of clothing, I'll say, no, let me wait. Let me stabilize first. Okay? So unakuta ya kuwa maybe arguably the aggregate demand, maybe hata mtu akifanya compared to even October, it will be a significant decrease in the same. Because I don't think that stimulation has happened. If anything, the opposite has happened. When you see even investments, whenever you see investments, we are happy as economists. Because actually you can think about that actually stimulating demand positively. Think about government expenditure. Mweni Mercy, please, you are distracting us. If you think about even exports, and that's why you always hear many governments, richer governments will always tend to have a higher value in terms of exports, especially as compared to the goods or services coming into that kind of an economy, right? So I'll argue that if it's compared with the two, this one will be a good type of inflation rather than a bad type of an inflation because of that positive effect on demand for goods and services within the economy. The not so good inflation, and I'll give you the reason as to why that is the case, is the one that we call the cost push. Cost push, we are talking about cost of production going up and firms passing these costs to consumers in terms of increased prices for the goods and for the services. Okay. So it will be the not so good type of inflation as a result. Mweni Mercy, if I see your name again, I'll just remove you from the class. It will be as simple as that. Right? So we can use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework to actually illustrate these two types of inflation, right? Both the demand pull and the cost push type of inflation. Begin with the demand pull. You can see we are using the same framework where we have the price level as against the output. Why? Maybe I should redo these diagrams again. National output. So we have the red representing the demand, aggregate demand, and and the black one representing the aggregate supply. So we are talking about the aggregate and then the demand pull inflation being caused by an increase in aggregate demand. And as we said, aggregate demand comprising of those 5 components. Okay. And if that is the case, so we are talking about any increase in consumption, investment, government expenditure, say exports, causing this rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve from AD0 to AD1, as you can see here. But what we are interested with, because we are defining inflation as the increase in price level, it will be clear that that rightward shift will have caused an increase in the price level from P0 to P1. And that is basically what the inflation that we'll have been experiencing as a result of an increase in the demand, aggregate demand. Okay. Compare this. Let me just analyze them simultaneously before I come to which is the good, which is the bad type of inflation. Compare it with the cost push inflation. And we're talking about cost push inflation being caused by an increase in cost of production. And because cost of production is increasing, farms being in the business of doing what? Of making profits, and not only making profits, but maximizing on profits, one will imagine that they'll push these costs to consumers in terms of higher prices. And because the prices is going up, one will imagine that, I hope I'm being heard. Hello, 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 hello. Some people are saying I cannot be heard. Can I be heard? Can people confirm whether I can be heard or not? I also saw in my at my end that there was an issue. Na wakati inafanyika hivyo huwa nanyamaza because inaniambianga the internet is unstable. Kwa hivyo saa ile unasikia nimenyamaza na nyamaza kwa kungojea ikuje stable. But today I think my provider, even before the class, I noticed that leo kunaweza kuwa na shida. I was trying to watch some videos and they were hanging. But let's see what we can do. Uzuri ni tuko tunaka 1 hour na karibu tunamaliza. Right? So this increase in production costs, because actually the business will know that the prices have gone up, maybe less will be demanded. They will basically tend to supply less. But this lessening in supply will be shown by this aggregate supply curve experiencing a leftward shift from the blue aggregate supply curve to the red aggregate supply curve. What we're interested with is this. What is happening between P0 and P1, because we are defining inflation as increase in the price level. And you'll see that passing of prices to consumers will basically have made the price level increase from P0 to P1. So as I said, and maybe the question here will be, which is the good type of inflation? And I'm arguing that the good type of inflation is the first one. Why? See what's happening here and compare it with what is happening here. In the demand pool, you can see that our national output has increased from Y0 to Y1. So prices may increase ndio, lakini pia demand may increase. So our national output has increased. More goods and services are being demanded in the economy. That will basically be a proxy, even when you talk about even economic growth. Wakati mnasikia wanasema GDP, it may increase by this much. And you normally want GDP to increase rather than to decrease. Because when GDP is increasing, it's a proxy that even the wealth in the country, the national wealth, is increasing. So it does that with respect to demand pool. But if you see what's happening with cost push, because of the dynamics of cost push, if prices are going up and my income remains the same, meaning that I'm demanding less. So actually we'll talk about a decrease in, say, even things like economic growth. Because when we talk about national output, let me just see whether I have things that need to be closed. I can see my Zoom complaining. Yeah, let me close this. Let me close that. Tunibaki na the most essential. Okay. So you'll see that because this one is a decreasing, we can call it the not so good type of inflation, because maybe that's where even in Kenya, that's where we are at. Wakati unasikia pesa hakuna. Wakati unasikia businesses are closing, businesses are relocating. All right? Businesses are downsizing, meaning that they are laying off people. Maybe that's where we are right now in a country. Lakini, wakati iko juu. In fact, inflation is a good thing. It is normally presented as being a bad thing, lakini ni kama ile joto ambayo iko kwa engine wakati gari inaguruma. Right? Would you rather not have that joto? Maybe no, yes. But wakati hiyo joto iko inamaanisha ya kuwa kila kitu pia kina run vizuri. So it's just an unintended consequences of the fact that there is a car, the car must run. So hiyo joto ambayo inakuwa generated, the heat, the friction and all that, that is something that actually inflation is. If it's we can think about an economy as an engine. It's just the unintended consequences of the fact that economies, people must meet, people must exchange good. The economy must economy, for lack of a better term. Kwa hivyo usiwahi dhani ya kuwa inflation ni kitu kibaya sana. Kunakuwa na uzuri wake na manufaa yake. As long as the economy is improving or is growing, it is something that has to be factored in most instances. Indeed, Japan between the mid-90s and I think just mid-2010s, they have been actually experiencing the opposite of inflation, what is called deflation, deflation being the decrease in the price level of goods and services. And they had it tough. Hapo ndio pahali ambapo China overtook them. And I think even Germany overtook them as the largest economies in the world. Japan, for the longest time when I was growing up, it used to be the second biggest economy in the world. Nowadays, I think they're either the fourth or the fifth, if that. Okay, because the economy was not growing. They were actually experiencing decreases in prices. But that decreases in prices being an indication that actually maybe their national output, rather than growing, was actually doing what? Was actually decreasing at the end of the day. All right. As I said, inflation, when it is what? It is Purity anasema sauti na katika katika. So I'm sounding like a DJ. I hope I'm clearer right now. What I've done, I closed the apps. If it is planned for, inflation can be a force for good, as I have just said. If it's planned for, it's okay. And in most instances, it is planned for. Right? Kwa hivyo inakuwa haina shida. Because ni kitu, kama umeplania shari, hiyo adhari ya shari inakuwa inadidimia. Shida ni ya kuwa wakati hujaiplania and then it comes. So maybe sometimes because life happens, it comes. It becomes an anticipated. Right? We talk about it basically being a negative thing, because when you talk about what? Redistribution of income. When you talk about, actually from an economic point of view, perhaps the most serious thing is the distortion of price mechanism. Remember in chapter 2, when we talked about the forces of demand and supply being allowed to set the prices of goods and services. So when we talk about that, P bar being the equilibrium price, we talk about the inflation having a negative effect in the distortion of this. So this economic ideal that prices should be set purely through the forces of demand and supply is kind of compromised, does not work as effectively as anticipated when inflation is put or is thrown in the mix of this. But with respect to the first point or the first bit, right? When I've borrowed 1,000 this month or this year, And then we agree with you that next year is when I shall give it back. And next year in Africa, right? And then you are like, where is my 1,000? Na kama hiyo in next year 1,000 because of inflation it will be worth 500, who will have gained? I as a borrower will have gained. Okay, because I'll be paying the money at a lesser value compared to when I borrowed it. And that's why I tell you anyway, when you with banking, with insurance, with the financial sector, it is actually an article of faith that you have to plan for inflation. Na lazima tujue what inflation rates are, what the expected inflation rates are, so that when we are coming up with interest rates, when we are coming up with discount rates, that will have been factored at the end of the day. When you talk about even money markets, and you people, you are becoming very good investors in money markets, perhaps more than my generation. If you're a person who just says, Mungu yuko, wacha niweke, right? And when betting came, betting, I think, is something that really hit Kenya 10 years ago. And people used to come and tell me, see, you just bet. And I used to tell them, no, I've done enough statistics in my life to know you don't just bet. Kinaweza kuramba na kikurambe sawa sawa. Because then some people actually used to think that all you have to do is just to put that 100 bob or that 1,000 bob. Then you get your money. Tell them, no, this is a risk. Can lose, and you have to be prepared to lose. So I used to see some of my friends being very depressed after losing, and then they're like as if the world is turned against them. Right? The same thing, because there's some gambling, there's some risk in which you must mitigate against when you are doing some of these things, because it's uncertain, right? It introduces uncertainty. If there's anything that businesses fear, if there's anything that the economic space fears, the financial sector fear, is uncertainty. And that's why we are more comfortable with risks. Risks, you've already calculated the probability, and then you plan for it. How you can cover yourself. Either you'll take an insurance, ama kama wewe ni mtu wa Mungu, utaomba Mungu, maybe kama wewe, that's your thing, but we don't recommend that. You take some sort of mitigating measure at the end of the day. Right? So that uncertainty actually is very, very serious in business, almost to the point that sometimes you'll find that where now you are experiencing high rates of inflation, what we call hyperinflation, economies basically fail on account of it, simply because of that level of uncertainty that is introduced in some of these very, very crucial economic decisions. When you talk about interest rates, when you think about planning for economy, right? When you think about investment decisions, what to invest in, where to invest, if we should invest. And perhaps one of the worst thing about some of this uncertainty in business is this. Na saa zingine, I think even Kenya, kama kuna kitu kinatuumiza at this particular moment is that. Like right now, if you give me, even if I have take a loan, or should I even take that loan, I'll say no. Let me wait for next year. Nione huyu Zakayo anaenda na aji na sisi. Okay? Because he is introducing these many policies, na saa zingine tu, you just wake up and then you hear something is happening. Na washa decide na inafanyika whether you like it or not. So you're like, no, let me wait. I'm waiting for a windfall in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And even I was sharing with somebody that I don't even know what to do with that windfall. I don't know how to invest it, because you might say you want to put it here. Kesho usikie sera imebadilika. Unaweza sema uweke pale usikie kitu kimefanyika. Sometimes unasema hiyo pesa hata ikiwa tu wacha tu ikae tu hapo tu kwa bank. And the opportunity costs actually kick in, because if I were to invest and I don't invest, that return that I will have gotten becomes an opportunity cost that has to be considered, arguably. Okay. If you think about resource distribution, some time back I was in Pretoria on some for about 4 or 5 months, and we had Zimbabweans there, very arrogant people, but good people nonetheless. Maybe I should have not even said arrogant. They are super confident people. And that time is when now this inflationary Nini had already started rocking the economy. And to an extent that we asked them, how do you people survive? Because, here in Kenya, hata ile ambayo unasikia kumekuwa na mfumuko wa bei, I don't think we have ever had it even half as rough as some of these economies out here. So tulikuwa tunauliza, na nyinyi mna survive aje? Yes, we can understand, tunasoma kwa paper, but how do you survive on an individual level? And they were telling us, no, you just check out of the formal economy. Kama ni sabuni unajitengenezea, kama ni mkate unajiundia, kama ni nguo unajiundia, kama ni chakula unahakikisha uko na your kitchen garden very well tended, at least to supplement. Kama ni lazima ununue kitu, ni ile ambayo you cannot, and if you can do without it, well and good. So you found a lot of capital really flying out of Zimbabwe, because that was the same time that most of the people who had at least some bit of money chose actually to just divest out of the economy. That's when some people went to Australia, I remember, some people went to New Zealand, some people went to US, Canada. Some people even came here in Gilgil. I don't know whether they are still in Gilgil. That was about more than 14 years ago. But you can see now that being an example of how resources actually just left that economy for other economies at the end of the day, right? So there's that resource distribution because of uncertainty. If there are people who are to invest in your economy, they'll say, let's not invest there. If there are people who are already invested there, they'll say, we don't have any hope in that economy. Let's go somewhere else at the end of the day. Right? Yeah, and some of the this point, the last point actually is related to, maybe it's a corollary to the uncertainty, the point on uncertainty, because you'll find that the best way to mitigate against this uncertainty is to increase the risk premiums, to increase interest rates, to increase discount rates, because you'll be like, because we're not sure, we have to have that factor that will actually prevent us from incurring losses as a result of, say, giving out loans, as a result of giving insurance, as a result of investing in a given sector, as a result of investing in a given sector. So as I said, and I'll just want to insist, if it's anticipated, it is planned for, the effect is minimum to totally absent. But if it's not planned for, if it's anticipated, these actually are the inevitable consequences. Let me just maybe spend the next few minutes. I'm out of time, imeisha. So next on Friday, we shall embark on unemployment. We'll see the types of unemployment, causes and effects of unemployment at the end of the day. So for those who are not here, just to remind you, prepare for a cut in the next 1 week. But hoping, as I said, contingent on us finishing and clearing out the course on Thursday, which we should be able to, but I cannot promise. So you guys have a good day. Let's meet on Thursday.